From the moment that Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya Targaryen conquered Westeros, issues regarding succession to the Iron Throne have abounded. Although the rules regarding succession were quite firmly established in the newly conquered and united Seven Kingdoms before the Targaryens even arrived, the fact that the Targaryen family tree looked more like a tangle of intertwining vines made the issue of whose claim supersedes the other a much bigger problem than it truly should have been in any normal circumstances. And as a result, House Targaryen was mired in succession crises on and off for essentially the entirety of its reign. However, the tipping point that really started the beginning of the end of the Targaryen dynasty was the so-called Dance of the Dragons. Although Targaryen family members and factions had gone up against each other before, the dance was the most brutal conflict that spelled utter disaster for House Targaryen, as a majority of the literal dragon firepower that their throne was built on was destroyed in the Civil War. The two warring factions were headed by Alicent Hightower and Rhaenyra Targaryen, colloquially known as the Greens and the Blacks. It comes as no surprise that this ultimately devolved into all-out war as well, because Alicent's children and Rhaenyra both had legitimate claims to the Iron Throne, and both were clearly interested in the power that came with that throne. And although war can never truly be justified, once Rhaenyra pressed her claim to the throne, Alicent essentially had no choice aside from declaring war against her. Her status at that point truly embodied the concept of, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Despite the fact that the war was between Alicent and Rhaenyra, it was ultimately Alicent's husband and Rhaenyra's father Viserys who was responsible for this clusterfuck that tore the Seven Kingdoms apart. He named Rhaenyra as his heir when she was his only viable option, but he didn't change anything once he married Alicent and she had multiple true-born sons by him. It's absurdly simple, but this is truly the beginning and the end of the entire issue that triggered the Dance of the Dragons in the first place. Rhaenyra understandably wanted the throne for herself, and it's even understandable why Viserys may have chosen her over other options. She was his oldest child, and she may very well have been the best option for leadership. However, the root problem is that Viserys neither abided by nor changed the rules in order to resolve the obvious and unavoidable shitshow that would be incited by this decision. One thing that's clear in A Song of Ice and Fire, but that Game of Thrones largely failed to communicate, is that the rules of succession simply need to be followed. Or rather, any kind of rules need to be followed. The laws of Westeros don't allow anyone to choose whoever they like to inherit any noble seat, as just giving a lordship or throne to whoever the most powerful person or people decide should have it would likely create far more problems than it would solve. Essentially, having solid, codified rules of succession, even if they're not particularly fair, ensures that people aren't constantly going to war to seize control of a certain position just because they have the power or support to do so. And therein lies the problem with Viserys naming Rhaenyra his heir. By the fundamental rules and customs of Westeros, Rhaenyra should have been first in line to the throne until Viserys had a true-born son. But when Alicent's sons were born, Viserys didn't change his decision regarding who his heir should be. Nor did he change the rules of Westeros itself. He basically decided that the rules still applied to everyone but him, and he wanted to break them in this instance just because that's what he wanted to do. He even made it clear that he expected Rhaenyra's firstborn son to ascend to the Iron Throne after his mother. He had no intention of altering the laws of succession in Westeros, and he didn't even have any intention of altering the laws of succession for the Iron Throne. He simply wanted Rhaenyra to be queen, and decided he could break the rules this one time without recognizing that he was giving everyone the opportunity to break the rules every time if Rhaenyra actually became regent. In doing this, Viserys essentially guaranteed that unless Rhaenyra willingly gave up the throne, a civil war was going to break out among the remaining Targaryen familial factions, no matter what. By doing what he did, he created an enormous rivalry between the Greens and the Blacks. But what makes it so dangerous is that he established a scenario where both sides could make a legitimate argument to justify themselves and their own claims. Alicent arguably had the upper hand in that her claims were based on thousands of years of established laws. But Rhaenyra still had a leg to stand on because her ascension to the throne was the king's command. And Viserys' choice truly left both Rhaenyra and Alicent with very few options to resolve the dispute, aside from declaring all-out war. But interestingly, Alicent actually initially pushed for what was potentially the only way to resolve the issue when she lobbied Viserys to marry Rhaenyra to their eldest son Aegon. It wasn't a perfect solution, and Rhaenyra understandably resisted it, because it would have largely diminished whatever political power she could have gained by being the only Targaryen queen or king in the Seven Kingdoms. Viserys was also possibly rightfully paranoid that Alicent was simply angling for more power for herself and House Hightower. But regardless, this option was likely the best avenue to avoid the Dance of the Dragons, which ultimately wound up destroying the power that House Targaryen relied on. And by refusing it, both Viserys and Rhaenyra essentially forced Alicent to go to war against their wishes, if she had any hope of the survival of her or her children. Or potentially even her entire family and House Hightower. Westeros is undoubtedly an extremely misogynistic society on its own. Having a reigning queen would be a tough sell in any circumstance. But so long as there is a legitimate male heir, Rhaenyra's claim to the throne would always be under question and attack. If the situation were any different, Rhaenyra might have hope of truly and indisputably becoming queen regent. But when there are legitimate sons of the king still living and breathing, Rhaenyra's status as queen would never cease to be a problem. And even beyond that, as a result of Viserys simply deciding to skip the normal standards of succession for a single generation, and then continuing as normal, this dynamic essentially poises Rhaenyra's descendants and Alicent's descendants to be at war for as long as they both exist. Putting Rhaenyra on the throne as the exception to the rule would call the legitimacy of any queen or king who follows her into question. And the only way those questions can be stamped out is if the rival claimant bloodline is extinguished for good. If the Hightowers ever wanted to be at peace with House Targaryen again, they would have to defeat Rhaenyra and ensure that their side of the family inherits the Iron Throne. One of the many fatal flaws of House Targaryen is their misunderstanding of the culture that they conquered, as well as the mistaken belief that their word should and would be law in the eyes of the people that bent the knee to them. When dealing with literally thousands of years of established precedent, the notion that Viserys could break the rules simply because he wanted to was idiotic to begin with. And although Rhaenyra understandably supported the decision to name her as his heir, unless she was a total idiot, she recognized this inevitable future issue as well. And yet, neither of them would agree to actually unite either side through marriage, which ultimately gives Alicent the moral, social, and political high ground over both of them. Many in Westeros would likely support Aegon's claim to the Iron Throne over Rhaenyra's no matter what, both because they're sexist, but also because they would recognize the existential threat that it could pose to their own legacies. Because again, if a precedent is established that whoever is in charge at a certain time can decide who succeeds them based on their individual preference, then one rogue lord or lady could end the security that a family may have had over a specific lordship for centuries or even millennia. And it should go without saying that if Viserys is allowing for the mere possibility that the oldest child, regardless of sex, should inherit without actually confirming it one way or another, it could quite literally throw the entirety of Westeros into chaos. At the time of the dance, the Targaryens have been ruling Westeros for a little more than a century, and throughout that time, they've kept their gene pool a puddle. Even if they want to play fast and loose with succession rules, the impact that it can have on their families is somewhat limited. In contrast, many noble houses in Westeros have existed for literally thousands of years, constantly intermarrying with one another. Even if only including the past few generations of marriages, if the hard and fast rule becomes a little softer and looser, it could be absolute madness. Nearly every claim could be called into question, at least enough to justify houses going to war with each other to increase their own power and holdings. And in that context, it's honestly surprising that Rhaenyra even got as much support as she did. But the most obvious, crucial, and immediate problem that made the Dance of the Dragons a near necessity for Alicent and House Hightower is that while Viserys may have wanted to break the rules instead of changing them, the rules were still the rules. And on some level, Rhaenyra would always be seen by some as a usurper who was stealing her brother's rightful claim. And her position would never be safe unless Alicent's sons were dead. Rhaenyra's position would never be fully secure, so long as there was anyone who could make a legitimate rival claim to her own. One of the major moral lessons of A Song of Ice and Fire is that war is never justifiable no matter the circumstance. So even when factoring Alicent's need for self-preservation and the desire to save her children's lives, tearing the entire country apart is not an appropriate response to the threat that was being posed to her and her kids. But it is a relatively understandable response given the situation, and given that by all normal Westerosi standards, Alicent's son's claim was the better one. And again, Alicent did seemingly look for ways to avoid this becoming an issue, but once Rhaenyra made it clear that she intended to claim the throne for herself, if Alicent had any hope of survival for herself or her family, then the only way of ensuring their safety was to go to war against Rhaenyra and win. And obviously, Viserys is ultimately responsible for the civil war and the beginning of the end of his house, as he was both unwilling to change the rules of inheritance to favor the oldest child regardless of sex, and was unwilling to follow the laws of succession and allow his son to ascend to the throne, as the entire world would have expected him to. It will be interesting to see how House of the Dragon treats this entire conflict between these characters and houses, and how they characterize people like Rhaenyra and Alicent. Fire and Blood obviously offers a significant amount of insight into the actual events of the era, but it's a relatively biased account of one of the biggest turning points in the history of Westeros, that admittedly has little to no information about a great deal of what actually happened between these characters. But, based on the facts and events as they transpired alone, it's difficult to deny that the survival of Alicent Hightower and her family may have completely relied on defeating Rhaenyra by any means necessary. And it's unfortunately obvious that from a political standpoint, once Viserys made his intentions clear, Alicent really only had one avenue to pursue if she wanted to survive. But what do you think? Was Alicent justified in fighting for the Iron Throne in her son's name? Was Rhaenyra right to press a claim that her father bestowed upon her, but that would always be under question? And how will House of the Dragon portray these relationships between these characters? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.